It's been a while since I've done one of these, but last night the Japanese patch notes for Splatoon 2 version 4.5 came out, so I decided I think I would go through these and give my thoughts on some of the new patch notes. I don't think I've actually done one of these videos since like version 3, I think. This was the last time I did it. So it's been quite some time, but nevertheless, we're going to go through these and we're going to talk about some of the changes. There isn't too much. It seems like there isn't really anything drastic happening. Just a lot of small changes, so it probably won't be a very long video, but nevertheless, let's get right into it. First up, the Sploosh-O-Matic, the Splattershot Jr., and the Aerospray all have their ink recovery lag reduced by 5 frames. Ink recovery lag is basically the point in which you can't recover your ink after you do an action, firing, using your sub, or something like that. It all depends on the weapon itself. The main weapon of the Sploosh Jr. and Aerospray are all having their ink recovery lag after firing reduced by 5 frames. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, and it kind of isn't really a whole lot. I don't know the exact numbers that it has currently, but I think this is more or less just a change so they can continue to fire, as these weapons are more primarily focused on just painting the ground, and this adjustment was probably made so they can continue to just do that. Go from like standing, shooting, and painting the ground to using, recovering your ink and then standing back up to shoot again. It's just to, continue that and keep those going with that. And then the Aerospray is also, they improved the painting of its feet when you fire. So now it's more likely to paint your own feet when you fire the Aerospray as you move along. A lot of weapons kind of suffer from this, where they just don't paint their feet. I don't think the Aerospray is really one thing that it really would be necessary for, but maybe I'm wrong. The 52 gal had its damage against the Splatbrella shield increased by 21%, and its damage against splash walls increased by 10%. I actually don't really feel that the 52 really needed to have a higher damage against the Splatbrella shield, because the 52 kills in such a fast time to kill. It kills in 13 frames. Which is actually pretty low. A lot of weapons are up in like the higher teens or even above 20, and the 52 gal is actually one of the fastest killing weapons in the game, and it can utilize the time between the Brella firing and getting its shield back up. So continuously firing as a 52 at a Splat Brella puts the Brella in a bad situation. It doesn't matter how much damage you're doing to the shield, the Brella has to make the decision of, do I just hold the shield up and pray, or do I drop the shield and try and fire back and hope that I don't get killed in those frames. It's still a good thing, obviously, because I think just about anything should be able to sustain itself and be able to break and handle a 1v1 against the Brella. The Brella was, at launch, a really good 1v1 weapon, or I guess I shouldn't say launch because it was kind of weak with the time between firing and bringing the shield back up, but it was a really good 1v1 weapon. Basically, it outperformed almost every weapon in a 1v1. But now they've over time made it to where just about anything can damage its shield and survive that 1v1. But I definitely feel like the 52 gal was one of those ones where the shield health didn't really matter to it. And then the change to splash walls, that's just kind of an eh. Splash wall fights rarely happen anymore, so the damage increase to splash walls is kind of irrelevant. The 96 gal had its damage against the Splatbrella shield increased by 57%, and again, walls by 10%. The 96 was probably a weapon that needed that damage more, as its time to kill is higher than the 52, and it can't really do the same thing with killing between the shot and shield. So this probably needed it more than the 52 gal did. And then the Luna Blaster had its damage against the shield increased by 64%. Don't really think it needed it either, as blasters can just shoot over the Brella shield or shoot past the Brella shield and still have the damage done to the user. I don't really think this was necessary, but whatever. Blasters have always kind of been the counter to the Brella, as the Brella shield means nothing to the blaster's indirect damage, so you could just shoot past them or shoot above them, and the Brella couldn't do anything about it. So I don't think this really was all that necessary to something that already countered the weapon. Adjustments have been made to the Rapid Blaster, where now using main power-up increases the blast radius of them, which basically means that the Rapid Blaster is probably going to become more relevant again. And that's kind of a scary thing, because the Rapid Blaster is probably one of the more annoying blasters to deal with, as it has a long range and it can just output so much damage in a quick time. So I would say expect to see more Rapid Blasters. The Squeezer had its damage against the Brella shield increased by 57%, the damage against walls done by 10%, the damage against Baller by 17%, damage against the Booyah Bomb by 17%, and damage against the Rainmaker done by 10%. These are all changes because basically the Squeezer's damage output is varied depending on if you're tapping or if you're holding. So it sort of needs these changes to where it can still stay in the game against these sort of shields, I guess would be the best way to describe them all. And so it just basically means that the damage could be better against these things depending on if you're holding or if you're tapping. The damage can be better based on, well, what you're doing. And it's just kind of better for the Squeezer at all to be able to handle itself against these shields. So I think it is a good change. Carbon Roller had its horizontal flick recovery lag reduced by 4 frames, and its damage against the Splat Umbrella shield increased by 13%. I think we're starting to see a trend here. They're sort of, you know, they're trying to bring weapons that didn't previously get buffed against the Umbrella shield, but they're probably trying to bring them all back up to where they should be against the weapon. But I think this is a good change for Carbon Roller. The Carbon Roller has been in a really bad situation since Splatoon 2. Hasn't been as good as it was back in Splatoon 1. So I think any Carbon Roller can take whatever they can get at this point. They're just grasping at any changes that will make the weapon a bit more fun and enjoyable and balanced to play. Splat Roller and Flingza Roller had their damage increased by 13% against the Splat Umbrella shield. This is probably another weapon that needed it the most, as the Rollers really suffer against the Umbrellas. The Umbrellas were one of the early weapons to kind of shut down Rollers, especially the Dynamo, so these weapons probably need it a lot. When using the GooTuber, you'll now be able to cancel the animation out of hopping out of a charge just by going back into swimming mode. So basically when you're holding a charge and then you jump out of your ink to fire, you can now actually cancel that animation by just going back into the ink. Couldn't do that before, now you can. Basically this just means that it would be applicable in situations where you didn't really want to get out of ink, or maybe you're doing a thing where some people will hold onto the charge and then jump out of the ink to reset the charge and then just go back into the ink to do it again. And this would mean less downtime between when you're jumping and making yourself visible and then trying to swim away again. Now you'll be able to just cancel it and immediately get back into swimming. Now when a Tri-Slosher sloshes, the middle line of ink will now actually go farther forward, meaning it'll get a bit more coverage in the front as opposed to the sides of it. The Mini Splatling run speed while charging is increased by 3%, and run speed while shooting is increased by 8%. I think the Mini Splatling is one of those things that needs to have a lot of changes done to its speed and how run speed affects it, because between Splatoon 1 and Splatoon 2 they heavily nerfed its mobility, and now it can't move around as fast as it used to be, and that was one of the things that made it really good in Splatoon 1, was how mobile it can be. Now it's just nowhere near that, and so I definitely think that this is something that's really needed. I definitely think maybe a bit more is needed, but I can't really be picky at this point. Just taking whatever you can get and hoping that eventually it gets to a place where it would be relatively close to what it used to be. The effects of main power up on the H3 nozzle nose has been nerfed. Now it takes a bit more main power up to be able to see critical damage. A lot of times you'll see H3 nozzle noses using main power up to increase the damage, so it can be a more, I think it's 99.8 damage from the 2 pellets out of the 3. It was something very common in Splatoon 1. You would see H3s using damage up, so they could get picks off of 2 of the blobs as opposed to the 3, and now they basically made it to where the main power up, you need more of it to even get close to those numbers. And then the Bamboozler actually sees nerfs. The damage against the Splat Umbrella shield reduced by 20%, damage against walls reduced by 20%, damage against ballers reduced by 38%, damage against Booyah Bomb reduced by 31%. And the main reason for this is because Bamboo just sort of destroys any form of shield. All of these things that is listed here, Bamboo just shreds through like it's nothing. It just cuts through them like paper. So I don't really necessarily think that it really needed it, as Bamboo is such a niche weapon that maybe these adjustments aren't really needed. But maybe there's some level of play where this sort of comes up more often that I'm just not aware of. But I've definitely felt like that was kind of what Bamboo was really good at, and that was like one of the things that it had over a bunch of other weapons, was it could just destroy these things, and now I guess they're trying to step in against that. The sloshing machine had its ink consumption increased by 20%, and then its area of effect hitbox reduced by 6%. Basically means that the damage from the splash or the little ink hitting the ground or an object or whatever is reduced by 6%. That little area, not the damage itself. The Explosher had its ink consumption increased by 30%, and the AoE hitbox as well reduced by 7%. So very similar nerfs to the sloshing machine. And that's it for the main weapon changes. Now onto the sub-weapons. The auto bomb's recovery lag reduced by 15 frames, which is actually pretty big, as auto bomb is one of the things that has a lot of recovery lag, and is actually one of the reasons why back in the day I would actually run a lot of ink recovery for the auto bombs as opposed to ink saver sub. It was what I opted for instead prior to the cost of the auto bomb going down. but now this is something that's been really good to see. Point sensor had its ink consumption reduced to 45% from 55%, and then its range decreased by 2%, and its velocity increased by 8%, and its effects with Subsaver have been reduced by 8%. These are just changes to make it to where Subsaver is a bit more of a viable option to pick, and make it to where its effects aren't necessarily as good, but it's still something that you can use and throw out a bunch of. I actually really like point sensors, so I like to see these changes. I don't care so much about the range being decreased or anything, because it's actually got a pretty wide AoE, so it can detect from a pretty sizable distance, so the range itself isn't really that big of a deal. I personally like to see the reduced in cost. That's actually a pretty big one. And then the sprinkler had its time to start painting decreased by 30 frames. That's basically when you place it on the ground and when it starts to start painting. That's been decreased by 30 frames. And then its radius of painting when initially placed, that means, again, when it first started being placed, is increased by 250%, which is pretty big. Basically, they're trying to make it to where sprinkler is a good painting option again, and yeah, I think that's a pretty good change. They needed to do this. The whole point of sprinkler was to throw it in somewhere and have it paint a whole bunch for you while you're out doing somewhere else, and this is actually a pretty good change to see. And then the damage of the fizzy bomb's second and third explosion has been reduced by 6%. I see a lot of people talking about the fizzy bomb doing too much damage, or in some people they joke about how the fizzy bomb does more work than most people in general. So I guess this would probably be necessary, and I guess a lot of people will probably be happy to see these changes. I don't really see it as too big of a deal, but you know, I don't know. There's probably some plane of play where this is a big deal to some people, and that's probably what this is being adjusted for. But I personally haven't seen it to be that big of an issue. But to those that want it, this is probably a welcome change. And then the only special weapon change is Inkstorm had its radius decreased by 6%. I personally don't think this was really needed. Inkstorm's whole purpose right now, and it kind of always has been, is to just throw in a spot like a zone and just sort of be the initiator for a push, or to get the paint rolling, basically. And it just to get things started, to get a whole fight started. And having this radius decreased is sort of an unnecessary change in my mind, as its whole focus is to just paint and be there and to just start something. And to have its radius decreased, I don't get it. I really don't. And then Bomb Defense DX now has an increased effect against point sensors when using a minimal amount of subs. So basically it has an increased effect against point sensors in reducing the amount of time that you're marked. And that's pretty much it for the big changes. There are some special requirements that have changed, the points needed to get a special, and I'll put those on screen right now. But basically there aren't really too big of deals. I've never thought that these changes in specials, reducing it by like 10 points or increasing it by 10 points, have really been that drastic of changes as opposed to a lot of the community, because 10 points is something you could get by pressing ZR once. So I've never really quite understood the whole fixation with being upset about 10 points. But yeah, that's it. So I want to hear, do you guys like this patch? Do you think that these are good changes, bad changes? What are some things that you wanted to have changed that aren't changed here? And what is something here that you think that shouldn't have been changed? So I want to hear everyone's thoughts, and I want to thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.